Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome again to another one of our Perspectives virtual series. We're focused on really unpacking the long-awaited requirements and guidance from the Securities and Exchange Commission. My name is Keith McHugh. I'm a director within our sustainability business. And I'll be your host moderator for the discussion today. And really the focus there is to unpack the state of these requirements, what they look like today, what they came out with, and how that differed from our expectations or others, and the implications really of what that means for you as you guys do business as publicly traded entities in the US here. So I've got the pleasure of being joined today by a panel of sustainability and compliance experts. I've been lucky enough to work with sustainability experts like this for a long time, over the last 15 years or so across different organizations. I've spent the majority of my time focused in my career leading public institutions in particular, along their own sustainability journey and with a special focus around carbon accounting, compliance, and reporting. So today's conversation and finally getting the insight that we were hoping for and expecting for so long from the SEC is exciting, and looking forward to having a detailed conversation here with some of my team members. So I'm going to turn it over to each of the individuals that I'm joined with here to have a conversation about this. We're going to keep this very informal and discussion based, more of a fireside chat. And you'll see as we go through this, there's two important logos on this webinar today: the Schneider Electric logo on the right and the EcoAct logo on the left there. Exciting news from our organizations together that Schneider Electric has successfully acquired the consultant group EcoAct. So you'll see individuals like Ely today with us as part of that. EcoAct's an international leader in climate consulting, net zero solutions. They're based in France, a lot like Schneider Electric. So a very well-respected consulting group, solutions values that really complement the Schneider Electric vision and our approach. So I'm really excited that we're able to bring that combined emphasis and experience to this discussion in response to the SEC's climate disclosure rules. So let's get started. I'm going to ask each of our panelists here to dive in on an introduction for themselves. And we'll start over here today with Olivia. Olivia, if you don't mind, give a little background about yourself and your engagement with the SEC kind of work.
Yeah, thanks, Keith. I'm happy to be here today. I am a senior sustainability associate here at Schneider Electric. And my role includes mainly developing and managing emissions inventories for scopes 1, 2, and 3. I also prepare reports for various voluntary frameworks like CDP and DJSI. And then over the past year and a half, I've been heavily involved in the build out and delivery of our regulatory reporting services, so our SEC services, as well as California climate disclosure.
Thank you, Olivia. Ely.
Hi, my name's Ely Bugarius. I'm a managing consultant at EcoAct, now happy to be part of the Schneider Electric team. I'm based out of New York City, and I lead our climate targets practice, which really aims to take our clients from climate commitment to climate action. And that's a journey that the SEC is increasingly interested in. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Lindsay, round us out.
Absolutely. Hi, everyone. My name is Lindsay Edelman. I'm a sustainability manager here at Schneider. Been here for about 7 years, and during that time, I've been leading our climate risk management services for the Americas. I also lead a team of talented consultants as well in the delivery of those services. However, my background, which brought me here, started out in financial accounting and assurance and providing those services to public and private companies, mostly public, as you would expect, and so happy to be here to share our thoughts on how climate risk can impact and the disclosure of that can inform investor decision making.
Perfect. A lot of expertise from this group that span not just what the SEC is required, but across the gamut of the compliance landscape that has evolved very rapidly over the last few months and even over the last year or so. We've done a few sessions like this really around these compliance metrics, and I'll start with a little bit of kind of framing out the discussion and some of the background, what's at a high level been introduced through this SEC regulation, and then we'll really open it up to this group here together to have a little bit more of a discussion around the implications of the new regulations there. You may have seen in a few months back, we did a similar session specifically around California's requirements and the new expectations there. That combined with what we've seen out of Europe with CSRD and now what we see with the SEC's requirements really can showcase a bit of a global trend that we've been undertaking here over the last year or so, specifically focused on bringing the voluntary reporting that many of you have been enabling for many years into a more compliance and mandatory reporting to bring organizations onto a similar level playing field of disclosure and reporting. We're here today, we're going to specifically focus our efforts on what the SEC has put forward. Very large documentation that came out of that I'm sure not most of you have read yet in its entirety, all 800 some pages of it. But we'll take a focus on really the major implications. So what is it that the SEC has required organizations to do at a high level? And reality of the high level is that this is a climate-related disclosure requirement. So it's based on both reporting and disclosure of not just where you are in your process on emissions, but the risks associated with large-scale climate change implications and impacts, and how that's going to be addressed from your organization's perspective overall. So you'll see a lot of different nomenclatures that come about in the SEC's requirements around large accelerated filers versus accelerated filers or emerging growth companies. All of these are essentially ways that the SEC has identified organizations in line with a lot of the financial reporting that already occurs and is required of these organizations. But that's going to dictate a lot of the relative requirements that you have, both from a timeline perspective and from an overall implications of emissions and climate risk reporting. So two major components that the SEC guidance is identifying. One is the emissions side of things. So especially for those large accelerated filers that have a significant presence in the marketplace, material scope 1 and 2 emissions are going to be the requirement, and verification and limited assurance of those emissions, which is an area that I think a lot of organizations have started on that journey, but requires a different level of guidance, consistency, and quality in the emissions reporting that you're managing today. That's a big impact for organizations, but a big change we saw, which we'll get into a little more discussion of, is that Scope 3 was ceremoniously left out of the equation here for now. And I think that's a big piece of the equation here around everything with the SEC guidance, is that this is a for now statement. So where does this exist today? There's obviously legal challenges that have been addressed already and nor coming along the way. And there is a expectation that there's going to be potentially more of these types of challenges that occur that may dictate some changes to this. But the end all be all of this is that there is a clear articulation from the marketplace, from different government agencies across the globe that's driving this reporting requirements beyond just what the SEC has done around Scope 1 and 2 emissions, starting that journey towards Scope 3 in the future. The second piece of the SEC guidance that's really the big kind of meaty piece is around the disclosure of financial risks around your climate implications. And we're going to talk in detail around some of those components here in just a second, but identifying the capitalized costs and the expenditures, expense and losses that are related to carbon offset purchasing, renewable energy credits, or looking at the implications of severe weather on your organization now have to be embedded as part of the reporting that you have from a financial basis to the SEC already. And it's going to be more focused on that kind of integrated approach in line with things we've seen in the past from TCFD, ISSB type of approaches. So lots of nuance to this rule and a lot of adjustments as we waited for it with bated breath for so many months. But the main focus of this is really, again, climate-related risks and the emissions associated with that. So with that, we're gonna adjust and transition a bit into a bit more of a conversation here. We've got true experts on the phone with me that I'm lucky to have around this, and we'll spend some time here going through a bit of that discussion of what is this, what's it going to mean for you directly, and that's the big question around this. So I may ask just to start with the panel overall, each of you, and maybe Ely, I'll ask you to go first on this, but What is the biggest surprise about the ruling as you know about it now, and what you were expecting potentially to come out as you guys saw that? Ask each of you to answer that one directly too.
Yeah, I think one of the big talking points when the initial proposal was initially released was the fact that the SEC had laid out some maybe slightly unorthodox ruling around emissions accounting. And at the time, a lot of my clients were worried about, because of the rules, their mandated footprints would not be aligned with the footprints that they're currently disclosing. And they would be worried about what are the implications of that? Do we have to restate our emissions for prior years? Do we have to start a whole new accounting process each year? Do we have to change our targets that we've previously set? And a positive surprise of this final version is that the SEC has made the emissions reporting rules a lot more flexible. And so now it's less likely that someone's current emissions footprinting process would be out of line with the SEC requirements. So I'm sure we can get a little bit more into the details of those exact changes in a bit, but that was one thing that stood out for me.
Lindsay, how about yourself? What caught you as the biggest adjustment or change or to your expectations of this ruling when it came out?
Yeah, I think initially, the way that the SEC had moved forward with the original proposal rule was almost complete alignment with the TCFD recommendations. We saw the same exact wording throughout that proposed rule, and we still see a lot of it, which I love, because really the intent of that was really to really inform, investor decision making. However, we have seen a reframing, and that's attributed to the slew of comments that they received. And so they are starting to increase, Ely, like you mentioned, like the flexibility of the disclosure to help, I think, the ease of the disclosure, whether it's changing the format and the definition of what is a short-term risk versus a long-term risk. Maybe we don't have to do short, medium, long for each individual company's different definition of what that means. But we're going to also help to maybe match that up with how investors would use this information. They might really only be caring about that 12-month view before and what happens after 12 months. So that reframing was a surprise for me to see that shift in language. But I think ultimately it will be a good and helpful reframing as well.
Yeah, good point. Olivia, what about yourself?
Yeah, so I'm going to go in a little bit of an opposite direction. I think both Lindsay and Ely kind of mentioned positives, but I do think in what you already stated before, Keith, about Scope 3, obviously it's kind of been talked about and led on for quite a while that Scope 3 would not be included in the final ruling, but I still think that comes as somewhat of a surprise just with the global playing field that we're on right now, with California including full Scope 3 emissions, CSRD including Scope 3 emissions. All of these kind of emerging regulations are already including those. So for the SEC to not include Scope 3 seems like a bit of a gap comparatively on a global scale.
Yeah, that makes sense. I maybe ask you directly on this as well. Just why do you feel that Scope 3 was removed? What was the driving force there? Because that obviously had a lot of discussion over the last year, really, around where it was going to land around Scope 3. So what do you think drove that decision to keep this out of the equation for now?
Yep, so I think there's a couple of different concerns. I think the first concern was the lift that companies will have to take. Scope 3 obviously is a quite extensive set of calculations and data that needs to be collected. And it really is a heavy lift on a company, and it takes a lot of time and a lot of investment to gather data that would be complete and accurate for investor use. I think the other concern here is the standardization that Scope 3 is not yet. So, I mean, in terms of calculations and data collected, we're not yet at the point, I think, in the journey where we're seeing that very standardized across, all companies' processes.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's the word that you've used there, and Lindsay, I'll go to you as well. You've used it in kind of your discussion at the beginning here around standardization. And as we think about the landscape of compliance, all these different organizations that have taken a a step and put requirements out there. Again, California, the European side of the equation, what SEC has done now. Lindsay, you mentioned TCFD as an alignment to the climate risk language that you've seen in the organizations. I think that's a big piece of this that I want to maybe unpack a little bit, is the standardization that we're seeing in a ruling like this and alignment with some of these other requirements that a lot of the same companies that have to report to SEC are also going to be required to report to California. So where do you guys see the overlap in those pieces? Because I think that's maybe leading to some of that question Olivia just mentioned around the lift and what is it going to take for my organization to respond to all of this?
I can take that a bit. So I think in terms of standardization, we absolutely are seeing quite a lot of overlap. I would say that, California is going to be a little bit more, I would say, robust in some capacity, mostly because the way that it's been framed is kind of full adoption of just TCFD recommendations as they are. And the migration of that or adoption of that into ISSB S1, S2. And so with that, I think you're hitting more companies who might be affected, not just public companies. And we're going to see a much more robust disclosure. However, we're also seeing some pretty granular requests, I think, coming out of SEC that are slightly nuanced. So don't want to kind of minimize the level of effort that would take for a first, second, third time going around to be able to prepare disclosure for the SEC. But maybe, Olivia, if you have some additional thoughts there, I'd invite your reaction.
Yeah, definitely would relay the same thing, Lindsay, or something similar, where if you do have to report to California, there are a lot of overlaps in terms of emissions reporting. California obviously is a bit more robust, especially with the inclusion of Scope 3. I think if you are preparing for California now, you're likely in a good place for SEC, but still taking into consideration some of those nuanced requirements that SEC has included in their final ruling. I think it's also important to note that as we say, standardization and alignment, right? The whole purpose of all of these for SEC, for California, for CSRD, all of them, the purpose is to standardize reporting and give kind of a one-stop shop that investors, stakeholders, customers can use to look at emissions. So while SEC maybe didn't require Scope 3 or some of these other items, it is important to note that if you are disclosing to California, there may be some serious consideration on voluntarily including your Scope 3 emissions in your SEC disclosure if you're already reporting them, to make sure that there is alignment across all of these different reports or disclosures that your company is putting out there.
Yeah, and we'll talk about some of the timelines side of the equation of what does it take to actually do some of this work if Scope 3 does come into play in the future, which it's going to be debated for months and months as SEC continues around this path. But it takes some time to build up your institutional capacity and knowledge around a Scope 3 inventory across the full suite of 15 categories to be able to really build a baseline around that and consistent reporting mechanisms. Along that same lines, as we think about some of the overlaps still that exist there, Ely, I'd love to get your context around this. When we think about the emissions side of the equation and some of the overlap between California, SEC, CSRD, other requirements in around the world, the concept of assurance and reasonable assurance and verification, if you will, of your emissions inventory comes into play in the SEC as it does with others. So be curious, kind of, how does that requirement of reasonable assurance really impact a company's actions or approach as they go into the reporting periods coming up for SEC?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's important to note that in the latest proposal, and as we know, it's held up in the courts right now, so who knows what the final timelines will be. But there was a change from the initial proposal that lengthened the period of time between the initial disclosure requirement of Scope 1 and 2 emissions and the assurance requirement. Right? It's now required to have limited assurance 3 years after you first disclose Scope 1 and 2, and reasonable assurance a full 7 years after you disclose Scope 1 and 2. However, it's my opinion that not many corporate controllers will let a sustainability team put unverified numbers in a 10K. in my experience, I just don't see that happening. So for sustainability teams, I think that they should be preparing to receive assurance on their scope 1 and 2 at the very minimum for the first year of disclosure in the 10K. And to do that, we're going to need to transition a lot of companies' footprints away from more manual Excel-based approaches into an approach where controls can be applied, changes can be logged, and generally easier to be audited. And so we've been talking a lot about starting the process for companies that have disclosed footprints in a more manual way. How do we get them over to a more controllable, auditable system? And as you said, Keith, this process can take a while. So I think it's good if companies start now.
It's interesting you bring that concept up of what controller or what CFO is going to allow an SEC report to go out without any kind of verification on every single number that goes in there, because they don't do that today. And I think one of the interesting concepts there as well is to notice that most of the major auditing organizations that exist in the marketplace, especially Big Four and others, are able to do limited assurance of emissions that have been calculated, outside of their purview in the first place. So that process, those relationships for the assurance side of the equation may already exist in a lot of your organizations that can accelerate your timeline to be able to enable that process. So a really good question. Similar vein of this, maybe Lindsay, ask you a question directly around another area of these kind of overlapping requests from different compliance requirements. How is materiality defined in the SEC? Because that can take a wide variety of definitions across each of these compliance frameworks that we've been exploring.
Certainly. I think it's top of mind, and it's a question we get a lot. And I was really glad to see in the final rule that they published a very direct approach of defining materiality here. And I was also glad to see alignment with regard to how they define materiality for financial accounting and financial assurance for the financial metrics in your 10K. And so when you think about the reasonable investor, right? They need to have information. What is important when making decisions to buy or sell, to vote, and if the omission of that information would substantially alter the mix of information that's in the marketplace. If it would affect any of those things, probably material, and you probably need to disclose that. That being said, I think there's also generally a pretty significant focus in terms of materiality from a quantitative standpoint. Similar to your financial information, it should be quantitative considerations as well as qualitative information. If it's going to be important, even qualitatively, it should be disclosed. And so those types of traditional notions of materiality absolutely apply here.
Yeah, that's an important aspect of understanding the boundaries and conditions of which each of us will be required to do that and put that information in. Olivia, I think about what Ely just said about, obviously this is still held up in the courts, and as any regulation of this magnitude would be expected to. There are competing deadlines with different compliance groups. SEC's initial, the first piece of potential impacts for organizations is as early as 2026. So given the timelines, some of the holdup in this, in the court systems, what should an organization do? From how soon should they be taking this action against this process for the SEC?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. And obviously, I think there's differing opinions just with, the timeline and the holdups and the point of the proposal to when it's finalized. It is constantly changing. I think the real thing here to think about is better to be proactive than reactive to a lot of this stuff. So I would say if we're thinking about, say we're taking the current timeline, which is 100%, I would suggest whatever is happening, in court or whatever the holdup is, we have a timeline. And I think that is, what companies should be looking at right now and kind of taking into consideration. 2026 is 2 years away. So that is not that far. And that is, it feels like a month to me in the world of sustainability because things move so fast around here. So in terms of, preparing, there are a lot of changes. If a company is just starting out, it could take a year, up to a year, I've seen, to bring on the right stakeholders, gather the data, figure out what's going on in your organization. And then I would say that you would want at least a year to practice reporting publicly. I wouldn't want the first report that you've ever, had emissions and climate risk data to be in your 10K. I think, practice is always better. For companies that have been reporting for a long time, definitely are in a better space. But I will say that this is quite a change that we're seeing in the merging of the sustainability and finance worlds, where financial stakeholders haven't historically been as involved in these processes. So I still imagine quite a bit of time needed to bring them up to speed, to train, to educate people in your finance departments and bring them into the mix for meetings and decision making and whatnot. So, I mean, the time to start is now, in short, and it will take quite a long time to get all of this information ready for your financial reporting.
Yeah, it's a good point. There was obviously nuances, some disconnects, a lot of overlaps between what California had put out and versus the SEC. California somewhat, I think, forced the hand of SEC to get this moving a little bit as well. But there's that same level of urgency on the timeline that, to your point, what it takes to do this, and that's what I want to transition to here in a minute, is kind of what's it going to take for organizations to actually do this work that's required, is not a small undertaking and takes time, 9, 12 plus months to be able to get your climate risks identified, calculated, to get your emissions built out in a way that's consistent and available for that kind of level of assurance that's going to be needed over time. So there's the business justification to say it's good to just be proactive and play a little offense here and start now, given the amount of time that's going to take, regardless of where the courts land. Recognize there's a risk there, but the risk, I believe personally, is mitigated a fair bit by the value that doing this has for an organization in the first place, right? Recognizing your scope 1 and 2 emissions, setting a baseline so you've got the ability to actually make informed decisions to address your emissions. That has made business sense. It's made business sense for Schneider Electric and EcoAct for years. That's where we've seen the growth of our organization as one of the most sustainable companies in the world. Those paradigms have coexisted together. So there's a business justification to get started pretty urgently and pretty soon in the process, because this is a journey, and that journey is going to have positive benefits beyond purely just the disclosure to the SEC requirements. So I want to pivot a little bit to that, kind of moving off of that into how do we approach the actual compliance as an organization? What do you have to do here? And Lindsay, I may ask you to jump in first with just your background around the compliance side of things, having started really diving into the SEC language. Can you give us a little more background on some of the kind of the climate risk from a technical standpoint, kind of what's required in those line items on financial statements, or the impacts and physical risk disclosure requirements? Can you give us a little more insight there, and we'll jump off from that point?
Yeah, from the requirement standpoint, we certainly have seen a bit of a change with regard to what's needing to be disclosed. Initially in the proposed rule, if you're familiar, which I expect you all are, there was an expectation to disclose at the financial statement line item level. If there's an impact, plus or minus 1%, you'd have to disclose it. That was pretty overwhelming, I think, for a lot of the folks who were commenting on the proposed rule, and we have seen a change. And so now there is still a threshold, still a 1% disclosure threshold, but it really only applies to 2 categories. And those are your expenditures expensed as incurred and losses. And so the incurred and losses piece, again, this refers to those severe weather events. So even thinking about past, severe weather impacts, that has affected your organization, which we often don't necessarily get into. We're always thinking about, the climate risk of the future, but now we're also talking about the future potential as well as actual incurred. So that's important. The other category is capitalized costs and charges. again, in the context of severe weather events and natural conditions. So both of those are pretty critical to understand and grasp. Part of that, and why I'm emphasizing the severe weather piece, is that we've seen a shift from kind of that TCFD language I talked about at the beginning. Transition and physical, transition and physical. Now we're seeing most of the focus in terms of impact disclosure around physical. That's not to say if you have a material transition risk, don't disclose it. Yes, if you have a material climate risk that happens to be transition, it doesn't matter what it is. If it's actual or potential, you still will need to disclose it regardless. But we have seen a shift to the physical risks and physical impacts. As long as those impacts could be on your strategy, your business model, or your outlook, those would be required for disclosure. So some things to think about there in terms of changes we've seen.
Yeah, that last piece I think is important on kind of the structure around more physical risk implications and adjustment. Ely, I may ask you a little bit about this because I know you guys support really heavily in this space, but those are not necessarily the easiest things to just quantify on a spreadsheet somewhere, and oftentimes requires software, which includes, GIS mapping and things of where these extreme implications are going to happen. Tell me a little bit in your view, kind of where does software play a role in all of this for organizations as we think through the timelines of disclosure?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I mentioned just before about software leading to a more auditable footprint, but you're right, software plays a huge part on the climate risk side as well. Lindsay mentioned the fact that you need to disclose all material risks, any risk that will create a material impact on your business strategy. And the SEC has pointed out that's not just climate risks on your operations that may affect your business strategy. It's also climate risks on your suppliers' operations if they have a material impact on your business strategy. And if you're looking for material impacts across your operations, we would recommend starting broad, doing a full sweep of the company, and narrowing it down to the focus areas. Now, if you have hundreds of sites around the world and hundreds of supplier sites that support those, doing that initial broad analysis can be extremely time consuming if you're not using a software that is going to enable you to plug in coordinates to quickly assess what are the risk hotspots in your portfolio so that you can spend time on the focus points, on the hotspots, understanding truly how vulnerable you are and how material those risks are. So software can provide an expedited process, especially in the screening phase. But as well, the part of the SEC requirement is to be able to disclose very clearly the process you take for measuring this risk. And if you have a software, it's very clear what that process is. So it can be helpful in a couple of different dimensions.
Yeah, I think and hitting both those dimensions you just did is important, right? Having that software is an important piece of what a lot of the assurance requirements come into play. Now, you aren't required to have software to have your emissions limited assurance taken care of, but it provides a significant boost to being able to get that done in a consistent fashion, and especially when the emissions calculations are occurring in the same space that your climate risks are being identified, because you're then streamlining what is really joint calculations occurring on both of those pieces. So that appreciate that. That makes a ton of sense. I think maybe Lindsay, back to you on the what it takes to do this. Software could be one piece of it, but regardless of the software side, when you're trying to tackle a climate disclosure like this, who do you see internally for the organizations that are going to be responsible for this? Who needs to be involved? Because it's not just your one sustainability expert anymore.
Correct. Yeah. Usually our main contact tends to be the sustainability expert or the manager, VP. It could be environmental health and safety. However, generally, these are some of the largest engagements I have ever worked with. We tend to see that we need a main point of contact from financial reporting. Incredibly helpful. They have, the connection to thinking about disclosure, as well as leadership generally. We absolutely need someone from the enterprise risk management side of the house. It's very difficult to get any progress without them because they're required for that alignment piece. If we're going to, ensure that this is going to be integrated into the organization to be managed going forward in a robust and comprehensive way, it's nearly impossible to do that without them. We rely on a whole bunch of different stakeholders from all sides of the business, real estate, marketing, strategy. And so there are data contributors all across the board, but the top ones in terms of owning this: sustainability, financial reporting, and enterprise risk management.
Yeah, I think that's important. And I think it's a shift. My background has been corporate sustainability, kind of in-house for many years at a number of organizations. And I think what I see is a big shift from those people being the leaders driving the change and the specific actions and doing the work, to having to somewhat facilitate into their own organizations all of these different parties that are going to need to support this. And so being able to organize all that is going to be a big lift, I think, for some organizations, depending upon who they have at the helm, to be able to enable that, and the partnerships that they're able to use to support that piece. If Olivia, if you've been working with customers on the compliance side for a while as well, what's the biggest pain point? Maybe we just hit one of them on the number of individuals that need to be engaged in this, but what are the bigger pain points that you see? And it's kind of secondarily to that, how do we address those for the SEC disclosure in particular?
Yeah, I will say I don't think I can narrow it down to just one. There are a couple of big pain points, and I would honestly be interested in what Ely and Lindsay are seeing with their clients as well. But Lindsay definitely touched on one, and that's stakeholder engagement and education. So there are a ton of cooks in the kitchen with SEC, or really anything that comes into regulatory compliance and kind of the merging of finance and sustainability. So really bringing all of these stakeholders up to speed, making sure they have, you have robust educational processes and materials so they can learn what the requirements are for SEC. It's not enough to just say, hey, this is what we need. They need to know, really the specifics and why we're doing this. And I also think it will be important for companies to identify clear roles and responsibilities for all of these stakeholders, because there will be a lot of them. And I'm sure there are many people in a company who this may not have been part of their position in the past and will be part of their roles and responsibilities in whatever position they're in now. So I think that is something that companies will have to clearly identify and make processes and materials for, education and roles and responsibilities. I think data collection, we can say it all, data is the foundation of, just about all of this reporting. So making sure that, your data is complete across the organization. Whether that's, your financial data that you're looking at, your consumption data for emissions reporting, all of it has to be complete. And I have a lot of companies and clients that maybe have been reporting voluntarily for a long time, but I do feel like as we're shifting into a space where it is legally required, that's kind of playing in a whole different ballpark. So they're still going through all the motions of maybe doing a gap assessment to make sure there aren't any gaps in their data that maybe have been missed in the past, that we can work to close. So I think those are two big points. And then my last one that's really quick, I think we've talked about it a lot, is alignment. So there's a lot of different frameworks. And I have clients that have to disclose to SEC, California, CDP, EcoVadis, all of them. How are we going to make sure that there is clear alignment across all of these and make sure that is transparent, that the processes, the methodologies, all of the assumptions are clear and concise across all of those. So I think those are big. But Lindsay, Ely would be interested to hear if you all have other ones that you've noticed.
Can take a go. As far as some other pain points, I think when folks have not yet undertaken the full screening that Ely was talking about to assess your climate risks. If you have your climate risks assessed and now we're talking about disclosure, I think it's a bit more clear. You say, hey, I have this information. Now I just need to put it in the format and get it through financial reporting and legal to feel comfortable. But if you haven't done that assessment, that can also take time. That can take time about around, I would say, between 6 and 12 months, depending on the extent to which you're going. but looking at your transition risks at a corporate level and your your physical risks at an asset level are pretty important steps to start taking so that you feel comfortable and you can get the visibility and alignment within your organization before disclosing and before some of those timelines take place. So once you get your team, I'd recommend get going on some of those assessments.
Yeah, it's perfect. Ely, about yourself?
Yeah, I think I want to hammer home the point that Olivia made on what happens when so many chefs get involved in the kitchen. And I think a lot of my clients that are sustainability leaders within organizations have had the freedom to develop and publish on a voluntary basis a lot of the work they've been doing on emissions accounting, on climate risk for many years.
Okay.
And they may not fully anticipate the level of scrutiny that is going to be invited from other people within their organization. And already I have seen some sustainability teams go through death by controls, where they haven't fully educated the controller team and the finance team on what they're doing. And so they end up with a myriad of controls and processes that are enforced upon them that may put a lot of the timelines and typical processes that they undergo in jeopardy. So I think aligning with those teams is massively important for everyone's continued success.
Yeah. Appreciate that, and appreciate kind of the view from all of you around the structure of this. It's a lot to unpack. We're going to continue to be unpacking it over time. But I wanted to thank each of you for jumping on and joining this discussion. Again, we're going to continue to follow up on this as the legal challenges occur and the adjustments to the language happen. But I think there's a bit of a call to action here on this, which I'm excited to talk about with everybody here, which is just, this is a lot of pressure that's going to come through on this. Ely, I think you made a great point at the end there, that there's pressure not just from the SEC, not from public institutions, not from your shareholders, but there's the internal pressure that those of you that are going to be responsible for this now have on your shoulders. We've got a saying in here at Schneider, the pressure is a privilege, and it's a big important piece for us to think through this with you guys and help you on that journey, because it's going to be a long journey to get you all up to speed with the requirements and get you ready to report and build this out. So there's a lot of opportunity here. The challenge is clear, but the opportunity, I think, is even clearer, that enabling this kind of work in your organization is going to drive business value, not just compliance value. So we're going to keep unpacking these types of compliance programs as they come up. I'm expecting many more of these to pop up now that California, the SEC, CSRD, and others have set the bar. So keep a lookout for future Perspectives virtual events. You can check that out at perspectives.se.com. Really appreciate the panel. Thank you guys for joining me on this, and thank everybody for tuning in and watching. And we'll see you the next time on the next Perspectives virtual event. Thank you, everybody.